Money was not invented because barter was inconvenient. Money was invented because barter was too weak to feed a city, pay an army, collect taxes for an empire, or hold order together in a world full of strangers. That is the real story. We like to imagine the past as a chain of simple exchanges. One person had grain, another had sandals, another had goats, and eventually money appeared as a convenient tool. But the history of money did not begin with convenience. It began with pressure. The pressure to feed populations, pay labor, record debts, move tribute, measure value, and keep society from breaking apart when direct exchange could no longer carry the weight of a growing world. Barter can survive where people still live close to one another. But once power expands, once wars need financing, once taxes must be collected in a common unit, and once trust no longer lives inside personal relationships, barter begins to fail. And that is the moment money enters history, not just as a tool of exchange, but as a tool for organizing society. To understand why money was born, we should not begin with the marketplace. We should begin with power, obligation, fear, and the need to keep an entire social order from falling apart. Barter feels more natural than money. It fits human instinct more easily. One good exchanged for another, one need meeting another. No treasury, no debt ledger, no state seal. No abstract symbols forcing an entire society to believe in the same system of value. And because of that, barter is often remembered as something more honest, closer to daily life, less controlled. But history moved in the opposite direction. What seemed most natural turned out to be too weak to carry a larger society. What seemed colder and more artificial, money, became the foundation of order, taxation, armies, long-distance trade, and eventually centralized power. That is the central paradox. A village can survive on familiarity. An empire cannot. As long as exchange lives inside memory and personal relationships, barter can still work. But once food must move farther, tribute must be measured more precisely, soldiers must be paid in a common unit, and rulers must govern people they will never meet. Natural exchange stops being enough. From that moment on, money did not just change how people traded. It changed how society was held together, through trust, through obligation, and, when necessary, through pressure. Barter did not fail because people were foolish. It failed because society became heavier than memory could carry. In a small community, direct exchange can survive. People know who is reliable. They know who still owes a favor, whose harvest was poor, whose animals are healthy, whose word can be trusted. Goods move inside relationships. Obligation lives in memory. Value is flexible because life is local. But that logic begins to break the moment exchange must travel farther than personal trust. A farmer may have grain, but the blacksmith may not need grain today. A mason may need sandals, but not in the quantity a shepherd can offer. A merchant may accept wool, but only after the caravan arrives, and only if the roads remain safe. The problem is not just inconvenience, it is coordination, timing, comparison, storage, delay. How do you compare fish to timber, or labor to oil, or a goat to a week of transport? How do you settle payment across distance, or carry value through winter, war, drought, or failed harvests? How do you feed workers before the crop is sold, or provision soldiers before tribute arrives? This is where barter starts to fail. Not at the edges of village life, but
but at the point where society needs exchange to become predictable. Once cities grow, once labor specializes, once rulers tax, once armies march, and once strangers trade without knowing one another, barter stops being a foundation. It becomes too unstable, too slow, and too fragile for a larger world. And when exchange can no longer rely on familiarity, society begins to search for something stronger than trust, remembered by name.
If we want to see where money began to separate itself from barter, one of the clearest places to look is ancient Mesopotamia. Not because it gave us modern money in a finished form. It did something more important. It revealed the problem money was built to solve. Mesopotamia was not a world of isolated farmers casually swapping goods at the edge of a field. It was a world of temple complexes, palace authority, irrigation systems, storehouses, labor obligations, and densely managed agriculture. Grain had to be collected, workers had to be fed, land had to be measured, debts had to be recorded. Authority had to reach beyond the memory of any one person. That is the key. In a village, people can remember what is owed. In a larger society, memory stops being enough. Once labor, harvests, rents, and obligations begin to move through institutions, exchange has to become legible, countable, enforceable. This is why Mesopotamia matters. Long before coins became common in daily life, Mesopotamian societies were already using systems of account. Grain could be measured. Silver could serve as a standard of value. Clay tablets recorded who owed what, who delivered what, and who received what. In other words, money did not first appear as a coin in someone's hand. It appeared as a way of organizing obligation inside a growing social order. That changes the story completely. What emerges here is not money as convenience, but money as administration. Not just trade, but accounting. Not just exchange, but control. A temple storehouse was not only a place where goods were kept. It was part of a system that turned harvests into rations, labor into duty, and value into record. The tablet mattered because trust was no longer personal. It had to be transferred into measurement, writing, and authority. And once that happens, money begins to do more than facilitate exchange. It begins to reshape society itself. It allows institutions to compare unlike things. Grain against labor, silver against rent, obligation against time. It allows rulers to see more clearly, extract more efficiently, and govern at greater distance. It makes larger coordination possible, but it also makes dependence more visible. Debt can now be named. Shortfall can now be counted. Failure can now be enforced. That is why the birth of money is inseparable from the birth of organized power. In Mesopotamia, we are not yet looking at money in its later imperial form, but we are already looking at the deeper logic that would define monetary history for thousands of years. Money emerges where society needs a stronger memory than the human mind, and a stronger structure than barter can provide. That is where the modern story truly begins. Not in the marketplace alone, but in the granary, the tablet, and the hands of institutions learning how to measure a civilization. Silver mattered long before it became the kind of money most people imagine. For much of early history, silver was not yet a coin passing quickly from hand to hand in a crowded market. More often, it served as something quieter, but in many ways more powerful. A standard. A way to measure value across things that did not naturally belong on the same scale. That shift is easy to miss, but it changes everything.
Once silver begins to function as a measure, a society no longer has to rely only on direct exchange. Grain can be compared to labor. Rent can be compared to livestock. A shipment can be compared to a tax obligation. Very different goods, services, and promises can now be translated into a common language of value. And that is where monetary history starts to deepen. Because the true breakthrough was not simply that people had found a precious metal they admired. It was that societies had found a way to compare unlike things with greater precision, over greater distance, and under greater institutional control. Silver helped make value legible. A farmer may never have held much silver in his hands, but the rent he owed could still be reckoned in silver. A worker might be paid in grain, yet that payment could still be measured against a silver standard. A merchant could move goods through a system where silver gave different regions, goods, and obligations a shared frame of comparison. This is what makes silver so important. It was not only wealth, it was a unit of thought, a technology of comparison, a bridge between barter and a more abstract monetary order. And once value can be measured in a common standard, power changes with it. Rulers can tax more clearly. Debts can be named more precisely. Contracts can stretch farther across time and distance. Trade becomes easier to organize, but obligation also becomes easier to enforce. The same silver standard that helps markets expand also helps institutions see more deeply into the lives of those beneath them. That is the quiet force of monetary abstraction. Silver did not need to circulate everywhere as coin to begin shaping society. It only needed to become accepted as a reference point. Once that happened, value no longer lived only inside custom, memory, or local negotiation. It began to live inside a system. And that is one of the most important steps in the history of money. Because from this point forward, money is no longer just about exchanging objects. It is about defining equivalence itself, about deciding what things are worth in relation to one another inside a larger order that more and more people must obey.
The next great shift was not just monetary, it was political. Silver, as a standard, had already taught societies how to measure value. Coinage taught rulers how to move that value through an empire. This is why coins matter so much in history. Not because metal discs were somehow more beautiful than barter or more elegant than weighed silver, but because a stamped coin could do something larger systems desperately needed. It could standardize trust in a form that traveled faster, paid faster, counted faster, and obeyed authority more easily. And that changed the balance of power. A coin was never just metal. It was metal marked by rule. Its stamp told people that value had been recognized, certified, and backed by a power above the transaction itself. The image of a king, a city, or an empire on its surface was not decoration. It was a claim. A statement that political authority now stood inside exchange. That mattered enormously once armies grew. An empire cannot march on barter. Soldiers cannot be paid in scattered promises or in whatever goods happen to be available at the edge of a campaign. They must be paid in a unit they can carry, trust, and spend. Once rulers began issuing coinage on a wider scale, they gained a far more powerful way to provision war, reward loyalty, and extend command far beyond the court. And the effects did not stop with the army. When troops were paid in coin, merchants wanted coin. When merchants wanted coin, taxes could be demanded in coin. When taxes had to be paid in coin, villages and provinces were pulled into markets they did not create for themselves. Coinage did not merely serve trade.
It reorganized society around the needs of the state. That is one of the most important turns in monetary history. Money begins as a solution to coordination, but under kings and empires, it becomes a tool of integration and control. A ruler no longer has to know each village personally or negotiate each obligation in local terms. Coinage compresses diversity into a common unit. It allows grain, labor, tribute, military pay, and tax extraction to move through the same monetary channel. That makes empires stronger. It also makes populations more legible and more reachable. For ordinary people, this could open new possibilities, a wider market, a more portable store of value, greater access to trade beyond the local world. But it also meant something harder. Life became more exposed to demands issued from far away. A farmer who once lived mostly inside custom and local exchange could now be drawn into imperial taxation, military supply, and a monetary order defined elsewhere. This is the double edge of coinage. It creates cohesion, but also dependence. It helps build roads, armies, trade routes, and administrative reach. But the same system that expands order also expands extraction. Once power can mint trusted payment, it can also widen the circle of obligation. And when coinage weakens, the damage spreads just as far.
If the silver content falls, trust thins. If the state overreaches, coin becomes propaganda without substance. If war drains treasuries, the money that once held the system together begins to expose its strain. In that sense, coinage does not simply reveal the strength of empire, it reveals its limits. So this was not just the birth of money in a more familiar form. It was the moment money and sovereignty became visibly fused. From here on, coins do not merely help people exchange goods. They help rulers bind territories, finance violence, collect obedience, and project order across distance. And that is why the history of coinage is never just the history of commerce. It is the history of power made spendable. By this point, the deeper mechanism begins to come into focus. Money did not outcompete barter simply because it was faster. It won because it solved three pressures at once, and each of those pressures grew more dangerous as society grew larger. The first was exchange. Barter breaks down when two people do not want the same thing at the same time, in the same quantity, under the same conditions. Money removes that burden. It gives strangers a shared middle step. You no longer need to find the one person who wants exactly what you have. You only need something others trust they can pass on again. The second was calculation. A growing society cannot function on vague comparisons forever. Grain, labor, rent, livestock, transport, tribute, and military pay all have to be measured against one another. Once money provides a common unit, the world becomes easier to compare, record, and organize. Very different obligations can now be translated into the same language. And the third was authority. This is where money becomes more than a market tool. Once rulers can tax in a common unit, pay soldiers in a common unit, and record obligations in a common unit, power begins to travel farther with less friction. Money does not merely help people trade. It helps institutions see, count, and command. That is the real mechanism. Money solves exchange. It solves calculation, and it strengthens authority. Together, those three functions change the structure of society. Trade becomes less personal. Obligation becomes more visible. Trust moves out of memory and into systems. A village can live through custom. A larger order cannot. It needs records, measures,
payment channels. Standards people may not love, but must obey. That is why money changes more than commerce. It changes what can be governed. It changes what can be taxed. It changes what can be owed, enforced, and extracted. It allows cooperation to scale, but it also allows dependence to scale with it. And from that point on, the history of money is no longer just the history of exchange. It becomes the history of how societies turn value into order and order into power.
Silver mattered long before it became the kind of money most people imagine. For much of early history, silver was not yet a coin passing quickly from hand to hand in a crowded market. More often, it served as something quieter, but in many ways more powerful. A standard. A way to measure value across things that did not naturally belong on the same scale. That shift is easy to miss, but it changes everything. Once silver begins to function as a measure, a society no longer has to rely only on direct exchange. Grain can be compared to labor. Rent can be compared to livestock. A shipment can be compared to a tax obligation. Very different goods, services, and promises can now be translated into a common language of value. And that is where monetary history starts to deepen. Because the true breakthrough was not simply that people had found a precious metal they admired. It was that societies had found a way to compare unlike things with greater precision, over greater distance, and under greater institutional control. Silver helped make value legible. A farmer may never have held much silver in his hands, but the rent he owed could still be reckoned in silver. A worker might be paid in grain, yet that payment could still be measured against a silver standard. A merchant could move goods through a system where silver gave different regions, goods, and obligations a shared frame of comparison. This is what makes silver so important. It was not only wealth, it was a unit of thought, a technology of comparison, a bridge between barter and a more abstract monetary order. And once value can be measured in a common standard, power changes with it. Rulers can tax more clearly. Debts can be named more precisely. Contracts can stretch farther across time and distance. Trade becomes easier to organize, but obligation also becomes easier to enforce. The same silver standard that helps markets expand also helps institutions see more deeply into the lives of those beneath them. That is the quiet force of monetary abstraction. Silver did not need to circulate everywhere as coin to begin shaping society. It only needed to become accepted as a reference point. Once that happened, value no longer lived only inside custom, memory, or local negotiation. It began to live inside a system. And that is one of the most important steps in the history of money. Because from this point forward, money is no longer just about exchanging objects. It is about defining equivalence itself, about deciding what things are worth in relation to one another inside a larger order that more and more people must obey. But the same system that makes a larger society possible also creates a new kind of fragility. Barter is weak because it cannot scale. Money is dangerous because, once it does scale, entire societies begin to depend on it. That is the deeper risk. When a barter exchange fails, the damage is local. One trade does not happen, one need goes unmet. But when trust breaks inside a monetary order, the effects spread far beyond a single transaction. Payment stalls, supply lines tighten, taxes stop flowing, debts harden, confidence thins. And suddenly, the problem is no longer just economic. It becomes political, social, human. If soldiers are not paid, loyalty begins to crack. If merchants no longer trust the coin, goods disappear or prices rise.
If rulers debase money to cover war, shortage, or fiscal strain, the currency may still circulate for a time, but belief inside it begins to weaken. And once belief weakens, every exchange starts to carry more fear. That is how monetary strain becomes social strain. A money system is not only a tool for moving value. It is a structure of expectation. People plant, ship, lend, repay, work, and obey because they believe the unit at the center of the system will still hold tomorrow. When that confidence begins to fracture, behavior changes quickly. Hoarding starts, trust narrows, markets thin out, institutions demand more and deliver less. This is why monetary collapse is so powerful. The more successful money becomes as a system of coordination, the more devastating its breakdown can be. A society that once gained order through money can begin to lose order through the weakening of that same trust. And that is the final twist. Money does not merely help build civilization. It also teaches civilization how to fail.
Today, almost no one worries about exchanging grain for sandals or wool for tools. Barter feels distant, almost primitive. But the underlying problem never disappeared. It only changed form. The real question was always the same. How do large societies create trust between strangers, across distance, under pressure, and over time? That is still our question now. Modern money may look nothing like the systems that emerged in Mesopotamia, or the coinage of kings and empires. It lives in bank accounts, payment rails, credit markets, government bonds, and digital screens. It moves faster. It feels cleaner, more abstract, more invisible. But beneath that surface, the logic is strikingly old. We still live inside a world that needs value to be measured, obligations to be recorded, taxes to be collected, labor to be paid, and trust to be scaled beyond personal relationships. The difference is scale. Today, the network is larger, faster, and far more fragile. Your wages arrive through institutions you will never see. Your savings depend on systems you do not control. Your taxes move through layers of administration too vast for any one person to understand. Inflation can erode value without a coin ever changing in your hand. Debt can expand across entire societies, while daily life still appears normal on the surface. That is why this history matters now. We no longer live at the edge of barter. We live at the far end of its replacement. Inside a monetary order so complex that most people experience it only through symptoms: rising prices, tighter credit, weaker savings, heavier obligations, and a constant sense that the system is larger than any individual life inside it. And that is the modern inheritance of money. It solved the problem barter could not solve. But in doing so, it created a world where trust no longer lives mainly between people. It lives inside institutions, states, banks, records, and promises about the future. Which means that when money changes, society still changes with it. Only now, the consequences move farther, faster, and through lives that may never fully see the structure shaping them. So in the end, money was never just a convenience. It was a response to a deeper problem. How do you hold together a society too large for memory, too complex for barter, and too dependent on strangers to survive on personal trust alone? That is what money answered. It gave growing societies a stronger way to measure value, record obligation, move payment, collect taxes, provision armies, and extend authority across distance. It made larger coordination possible. It helped feed cities, organize trade, and stabilize systems that barter could never have carried for long. But money did something else at the same time. It turned trust into structure. And once trust becomes structure, it can also become power. That is the real threshold in the history of money. Not the moment people found a cleverer way to buy and sell, but the moment value stopped living mainly inside custom, memory, and local negotiation, and began living inside systems that could count, compare, and command. From that point on, money changed more than exchange. It changed what rulers could see, what institutions could demand, what debts could be enforced, what populations could be organized, what inequalities could widen, what crises could spread. In other words, money did not simply make society more efficient. It made society more governable, more scalable, and more exposed to the strengths and failures of the system built around it. That is why the history of money is never only about commerce. It is about who gets to define value, who gets to name obligation, who gets to collect, command, and extract. And when trust begins to weaken, who is left carrying the weight of that failure? So the story of money is not the story of a tool becoming more useful. It is the story of civilization building a stronger architecture of trust, and then living inside everything that architecture made possible, and everything it made dangerous.
Barter did not fail because people wanted a smarter way to shop. It failed because civilization became too large, too fragile, and too dependent on strangers to survive on direct exchange alone.
Money answered that problem. But the moment it did, it became more than a tool. It became part of the structure that held society together. A way to measure value, assign obligation, extend trust, and, when necessary, enforce power across distance. That is why the history of money is never only about trade. It is about the systems people build when memory is no longer enough, when trust must travel farther than a face, and when order itself depends on shared belief. Money made larger civilization possible. It also made larger failure possible. And that may be the most important thing to remember, because every age thinks its monetary order is normal, until that order begins to strain, and the structure beneath daily life suddenly becomes visible again. Money changes society. It always has, and it always will.